Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Great. Hi. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. So today I want to talk quickly about intuition in design. And before I do that, I just wanted to start by saying hi and giving you a really brief introduction to myself, because it's actually an important piece of understanding the context of this paper that I'm sharing with you. So this paper is all about the role of intuition in design, and that's something that's really important to me personally and in my professional design practice, because I fundamentally believe that good design requires having a finely honed sense of intuition about what to do next. Ultimately, I think design is about making judgments, and often those judgments occur on the fly in unexpected and spontaneous circumstances. So I'm a professor of interaction design at the California College of the Arts in San Francisco. And for the last 20 years, I've been working professionally as a design practitioner. And for many years, I worked at the design firm IDEO in San Francisco, where I was an interaction designer. And more recently, I've been doing research work on robotics and crowdsourcing. And I continue to have a really active consulting practice. And one of the reasons I think intuition is so important for designers is the rise of design thinking methods that really seek to operationalize design as part of an innovation process. So many of you are probably familiar with this kind of double diamond design process. It looks something like this. And in this process, the first diamond is this idea of diverging to explore a certain topic area and then converging to discover insights and define opportunities moving forward. This is all about identifying needs and opportunities. And then typically there's an inflection point where decisions are made. And the second diamond is all about giving form to those ideas. So here's where the design activity gets generative, and you diverge to develop ideas and then converge quickly to deliver and evaluate results. This is a really useful framework for describing observable design behavior that unfolds as part of a structured process over relatively long periods of time, but it doesn't say much about the internal processes of how designers make the intuitive decisions that they make along the way. So let's just imagine that we're working on a real-world design project, and to illustrate, I have an example here of a project that I worked on when I was at IDEO in about 2004. So this project involved designing a car for Toyota, and our brief was to do very early phase envisioning about what the car should become. And so in this case, the car was targeted at an older adult market, and our job involved doing ethnographic research to understand the needs and behaviors of baby boom generation car buyers. I should mention that this work led eventually to the design of the 2009 Toyota Venza. So typically, when you're doing ethnographic work, the first design phase goes something like this. You start by going into the world, and you gather lots of data. In this case, we interviewed maybe 15 older adult couples who were interested in buying cars. And then you do this synthesis process to try to understand and contextualize what the data means by reflecting on how it was gathered and find some structural patterns and insights in what was observed. And in doing so, you end up with some findings, or in this case, if it's academic research, you might actually be extending into theory on the topic that you're studying. So the HCI community has really embraced ethnographic methods like this because it allows researchers to understand the behaviors and feelings of users in an objective and empirical way, and then develop them into insights that enable the evaluation and construction of new knowledge. But I should note that to do this well, it's really important that you have deep cultural context around the stories of the people you're interviewing. So typically the research is focused on a very targeted topic area, and recruiting is really important to make sure you have the right criteria of people. And to do this rigorously, you also have to have a deep understanding of how what people do and say aligns with who they are in the world, and that is what helps us to construct these deep, kind of grounded insights. Now, many times in actual practice, designers in later phase projects are really interested in shaping the form or behavior of an experience or product. And this is the second diamond of the double diamond, right? So here, for example, is a voice over IP telephone that I worked on. And in this project, we did a lot of work going really wide to generate lots of wireframes and discover pathways through possible experiences. And then we did usability testing to make sure that the systems we designed were functional and enabling people to accomplish important tasks. And this led to detailed visual design, system specifications about what software to build and how to build it. And while this is all well and good, if you're designing things that have a lot of external constraints, like these two projects I just shared, that had strategic objectives and usability concerns and market forces, in actuality, nothing I've shown you really says anything about how a designer makes the routine judgment calls that are necessary to complete the design. So this is an image I took yesterday in my office. from a project I'm doing right now. We just interviewed 10 people. We have lots and lots of interview data on the board. And the question really becomes, well, what do I do? How do I begin to make sense of this data? What am I actually hoping to accomplish if I move one post-it from here to there? How do I know where to put it? Right? Ultimately, designers do stuff in situations like this based on intuitive judgment calls about what action to take next. And that comes through experience, and you learn it over time. I might be following a process, but every time I do anything as a designer, whether it's taking a photograph or making a drawing or performing a skill of some kind, something has to motivate my action at an internal level, and that something is always intuition. Okay, so the rest of this talk really describes a project that I did to better understand these internal intuitive actions that we make. And my hope is that doing so will provide some clarity on how intuition works from the perspective of a practicing designer. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of some background material just on what intuition is, and then talk about some work I did to explore intuition and some implications for design. So let's start with a quick definition. Basically, intuition is the ability to understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning. It is a thing that one knows or considers likely from instinctive feeling rather than their conscious thought. So in other words, intuition is this reflexive and innate kind of knowing. It's a form of inner guidance that's responsive to insights arising from the synthesis of inward and outward focus that we have when we design. And basically how this operates is that our intuitions emerge through a subconscious scanning of our senses that have this external focus coming from our perceptions in the world, but also an internal kind of precognitive experience that's beyond our rational or verbal awareness. We make these kind of impulsive decisions. Now, the problem with this definition is that while intuition can be defined as subconscious or totally unaware as an experience, it can also be understood as a conscious and reflective act of assessing the results of an action that's been performed. And the reason for this is that our conscious experience is something that emerges through learning how to perceive the environment we live in, and that learning is constantly happening because our intuitions are constantly being validated and disproven when we interact with the world. So in the second sense, intuition is really something that can be learned, and we're able to enhance our intuition, such as when we learn how to perform a new skill, and we're also able to tell ourselves stories about what we've done and why we've done it. So in this regard, intuition can be seen as a very rational and highly cognitive activity. So for the purposes of this talk, I just want to keep this idea of intuition somewhat flexible to include both of these processes, and we'll move on next into some background on intuition. So clearly, philosophers have been dealing directly with this for centuries, and there's lots of examples in the paper if you'd like to read it. But basically, the issue is that it's really hard to study intuition empirically, because that involves looking into somebody's mind. So a couple of the challenges are, there's just not a good vocabulary for describing intuitive experiences, so I would hope that we could come up with some new language for talking about it. There's been a decline in contemplative practices, considering introspection as a valid method of investigation, and the Chi community, I think, could do a better job of that. And as a result, the majority of empirical research on intuitive knowing has been relegated to qualitative techniques, including in-depth interviews, journal content analysis, reflections, and so forth. So many of you might be familiar with this diagram. It's popular among design practitioners. And, sorry, skipped it. And basically, the notion is to describe what it is that ethnographers do, right? When you're an ethnographer, you can't think and feel for the person you're observing, but you can see what they say and you see what they do, and from that, you can intuit what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And I think the issue I have this from the perspective of studying intuition is that it basically discredits the direct experience of thinking and feeling that the designer has when they're making their decisions, right? So I have a quote here from Bill Moggridge, a great designer, who said, "The only way to experience an experience is to experience it," right? Which makes sense, right? The medium is the message. And I believe if you want to study intuition, you need to experience the intuitive act. So what I did for this project, and I'll just go through it quickly, it's summarized nicely in the paper, is an autoethnographic study in which I examined the nature of intuition by doing an intentionally intuitive design project and taking very detailed notes about what I had done. So to keep things really simple, I picked a set of simple requirements. I chose a really constrained personal creative project, and my only goal was to follow my intuitions as the primary method, and then to take really careful notes. And I just kept iterating until I was happy with the results. Okay? So I decided to use a laser cutter. There was one in my department. I'd never used it before. And basically, my intuition was, I'm just going to use it, and that's going to be my tool. So here's the thing. When you first interact with a tool, you have an intuition, right? Like, I'm going to use cardboard. That'll be a good material because it's low cost and it has structural qualities that are really nice. But it turns out in reality that you have to cut down the cardboard and make it fit in the laser cutter bed. And then, I wanted to cut lots of pieces that had little notches in them so I could put them together. But then in reality, the power settings on the laser needed adjustment and the cardboard caught fire. And then it didn't cut all the way through, even though I had tested it. I wanted to make a grid of triangles that I could use to put together to create something, and instead I found myself putting out fires and learning software, right? In any case, the form I ended up constructing is shown here. And basically to do this, I cut out a sheet full of triangles, put them all together, and started realizing just intuitively, like, hey, there's a really interesting geometry here, right? I can create these structural spherical units. I paid a lot of attention to the inside and the outside of the cardboard, and one of my favorite findings was just that there was this kind of spherical shape that emerged through putting things together, and I was really pleased with that. And so I thought to myself, well, gosh, maybe I can take this apart and make another iteration. So here's the second version. I actually have a copy of it here. I can pass it around in the audience if anyone wants to see. And this one was really robust. It made me very happy. Intuitively, it just felt right, but it wasn't as spherical as I wanted it to be, right? So if you actually hold it, you'll see it's more like a cube than a sphere. And this made me have this realization that, like, hey, I can make a spherical shell if I just keep adding new trusses to this. So I did that, and here I ended up with my next version. Now I'm starting to run low on cardboard, right? And I got the math wrong, so I had to intuitively cut some circles to fill the hole, right? And so this process continues. And basically, it just keeps going. Basically, at a certain point, I found myself going very deeply into spherical geometry and learning lots of mathematics and discovering that everything was wrong, even though it felt like it was right, and ended up shifting to matboard because it was smaller and I could make smaller, more dense little spheres. And I ended up with these multicolor spheres that could be assembled out of different permutations and combinations of colors. And it was this whole kind of wonderful, totally intuitively driven design project. So what I just want to summarize with quickly is that I think it's a completely valid approach to, rather than talking to lots of different people, do lots of iterations on an intuitive design activity, right? And then synthesize those together to uncover some insights about what it is that we have intuited. In this particular case, I'll just summarize with two of the models that came out of the work that you can find in the paper. So, really the ultimate goal here was to identify and define a cultural vocabulary of design intuitions that we could use to enhance a practitioner's awareness of the reflective process. So at the beginning, I talked about the double diamond process, and I think for external kind of long-term design processes, it makes sense to split generative and evaluative, but for the active intuition, these two things are actually much more tightly coupled than we might think. So on the left, we have ideation and making, the divergence. On the right, we have evaluation and critique. We can also split this vertically. There's the external, right? The making and the evaluation happens in the world, but the creative thinking and the critical thinking happens in our intuitive sense, right? And what we get from this is the idea that when we are creatively expressing something, when we're making it, intuition is driving that expression. And when we're judging things, we are critically judging them. That's the source of our evaluation and critique. And through doing that, it's a process of reinforcing our creative thinking and our critical thinking over time. And so it's really actually kind of foolish to separate the generative from the evaluative, because in truth, these come together and they are one single kind of expressive judgment, and that's the basis of what intuition is. A couple other things fell out from the final framework here, and this was one that I created just to visualize the different aspects of intuition and design that came out of this work. So this model defines this 2x2 matrix with these two axes. There's kind of impulsive relative to reflective action. Stuff on the left is more immediate. Stuff on the right is things that I'm taking time to reflect on. And then there's sensory and speculative, coming from inside or outside my perceptions. And basically 4 buckets fell out of this. So the first was this idea of curiosity or creative whimsy. So it became really clear that curiosity is essential to design intuition as a prompt for speculative and impulsive creative action. So this is essential for advancing the design action in the absence of concrete insights or external guidance. And in my project, it played all kinds of roles, right? So it drove me to perform the study in the first place, led me to experiment with cutting and assembling cardboard in different ways. It made me ask if it was possible to construct spherical shells and experiment and explore with all of the mathematical complexities. And, curiosity is really about, like, what if I do this thing or that thing, right? It motivates us to the next step. I also found that intuition is critical for the efficiency of design because it allows us to make these feeling-based aesthetic judgments that sort of clear the canvas or the cognitive frame so I can advance to the next phase. So it's like, oh, this model's not done. I'll cut out these circles, fill the gaps, then I can move to the next phase and kind of put that behind me. Right? So we make these impulsive sensory decisions in part to keep the design process moving in a more nimble and agile way. A third insight had to do with inspiration and creative vision. So clearly when we're pleased with our accomplishments, we're driven to achieve more. And all kinds of steps in my process of self-reflection played a critical role here. So like at one point I came into my office after I'd been away for a while, and the sun was shining through the window and casting shadows through the sphere on the wall. And I was like, wow, the sun is a sphere, and it's like this cosmic connection. And I sat there just for 20 minutes watching the shadow move, and like the geometry and the potential of all of the stuff that could happen if I kept evolving that spherical shell. And then the last one is this notion of kind of thoughtful rightness, or really insight, right? Is the idea that only by drawing on the intuitive knowledge of what has worked in the past can insights be realized and actualized. So if you think about it, having an insight requires having an intuitive struggle to achieve and understand our capability for grasping the rightness of the knowing that we're involved in, right? So at many points in this process, I kind of advanced blindly into areas with no prior knowledge. I had no, expertise on spherical geometry, but I came away with new insights to achieve my goals. So just to summarize, I think intuition is the ability to acquire knowledge without the explicit use of reason or inference, and it's this very immediate pre-representational and pre-discursive experience of the world that all of our cognitive activity seems to be rooted in. And I know this is a very limited and kind of strange methodology for approaching these questions, but I think it's clear that through doing work in this way, intuition provides a means for intelligently framing and acting out uncertain possibilities. And this is really important for design practice and research, especially when we apply it to the design of like AI systems or responsive interfaces that are capable of making intuitive judgments with us or in collaboration with us. Thank you.
Hey.
Hi.
Catherine Isbister, UC Santa Cruz. I was really curious, since you started out saying you're teaching design practice, how this sort of autobiographical methodology of learning about insight, like in intuition, how does this, if at all, play into your teaching process of training new designers?
Greatly so. So I actually taught a class called Spontaneous Design Studio a couple of years ago, and pretty much the only assignment was to design the next assignment.
Wow.
I think there's a lot that can happen when you're open to possibilities, clearly, and when you trust in the unexpected potential, particularly with students, right, where they might have an idea of where they want to go. I don't want to have them working on my research, but I can kind of mentor them or nudge them along a path, and together we can explore.
Really cool.
So, yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Peter Dalscott from Aarhus University. This is brilliant work, but I'm thinking about the way you frame it in relation to design thinking, which is often a collaborative activity, and often one with quite specific, like the design space is to some extent set out in advance. And we've studied plenty of these processes, and your claim is that you can only study intuition if you do it in this introspective way. But I'm thinking there's a lot of reasoning being expressed verbally when you see skilled designers doing all this work.
Yeah.
How does that kind of judgment relate to the type of judgment you were talking about in this very exploratory work? Yeah,
no, it's a really interesting question. So I should mention this paper was rejected 4 or 5 times for exactly that reason. There was a lot of back and forth on methodology. I would by no means claim that the only way to study intuition is by being intuitive, because there's lots of things you can do by interviewing people or whatever. I think the point is simply to say that autoethnography is a completely valid form of gathering data and synthesizing deep and rigorous grounded results if it's done with a full kind of attunement to the different contexts that are involved. In terms of reflecting on our work, I don't know. I mean, I think what I've come to realize through this is just that intuition is so central to every impulse or every action that we do in the world that it's hard to separate the doing of it from the kind of metacognition or the learning that we have about our self-justification for why we just did what we did. And so I think theory, kind of evolves over long periods of time and gets codified in papers. In the short term, there's a ton of